next session, Rethinking Best Practices, is just going to be amazing, and it's going to blow you away. And no, I'm not hyping it. It's because I personally know Dr. Chris, and Dr. Chris has been an amazing figure in my life personally, and Dr. Chris is a gem for our ecosystem. But when you think about the term best practice, right, or the short phrase best practice, it's become a defining factor for private equity. It's also become a defining factor for a due diligence process that sometimes doesn't really include everyone. So when we think of best practices, we ask the question, best for who? A little bit about Dr. Chris Brooks. I have to mention this. So Dr. Chris Brooks is a proud son of a Jamaican mother and an American father. Born and raised in South Minneapolis, Dr. Chris is a Minneapolis lifer. He was born here. He's left several times and has come back, and he's committed to doing all the things that Brown Venture Group is trying to do right here in the Twin Cities, and we are lucky for that. With a strong reputation as a results-oriented leader, he is a solution-focused executive, educator, advisor, and change agent with more than 25 years of success across nonprofits, investment banking, real estate, and higher education. And I know the only reason why we're not listing more is because the list is too long. Amazing, amazing, wonderful person. His broad areas of expertise include entrepreneurship, leadership development, team building, coaching, and mentoring, DEI, venture capital, fundraising, business development, and community outreach. Dr. Chris and Dr. Paul have been two personally amazing people in my life and have helped me to rethink whatever I'm trying to do in the highest level possible. They are managing partners for Brown Venture Group, a venture capital firm here that's rethinking and redoing the approach to how to fund Black and brown startups. But I don't want to take all the time introducing him and all those things. You'll see his presentation. Please welcome Dr. Chris Brooks.
Check, check. That feels like a lot to live up to. So hopefully I can live up to all of that. I want to begin by just sort of thanking the team that put this track together, to Jeff for his upfront leadership. Jeff's an amazing leader. To Beatrice for just like making everything happen behind the scenes. So as Jeff mentioned, my name is Dr. Chris Brooks. Y'all can just think of me as Chris. And I'm here today to talk about this term and what is really underneath this term, best practices. So what has happened because of this term, best practices, is we as a nation, and in all transparency, we as a world, have lost out on an enormous amount of financial contribution from entrepreneurs of color and contributors of color who the best practices are just not the best for. And so we've got to think differently as we move forward if we want to actually capture the economic value of what these entrepreneurs and contributors can bring to the table. So I thought a wide variety of ways of, how do I flesh this out? And the one thing a person can never take from another person is their story. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my story, because I think my story will illustrate how I've come to the conclusion that we really need to rethink this term best practices. So this is my mama. My mama immigrated from Jamaica in 1963 to this campus. I don't know how many of you all would know this, but so the University of Minnesota is now an enormous campus. It used to be a lot smaller. And when it was a lot smaller, the Dinky Dome, which is sort of on the same block as McDonald's or up the block from McDonald's, that used to be a separate educational institution that was housed inside of the University of Minnesota. And so my mom got recruited from her small village in rural Jamaica, came up to the Twin Cities, went to the tiny little college that was inside of the University of Minnesota. My father is a state wrestling champ and a foster kid from Iowa. And so he left Iowa and came to the U of M to wrestle and study political science. They met and married in 1967. For any of you who pay attention to American history, that's the year of the Loving Act, when it finally became legal to marry interracially in all 50 states. Up until the middle of that year, it was not legal in all 50 states. Now, it was legal in the state of Minnesota, but their church on the University of Minnesota campus would not marry them. They were told that they would have spotted children and sent packing. So they went down the street, got married in a different church. So this is me as a child. I grew up in the middle. I've got an older sister who's been a nurse in the federal system for 25 years. I've got a younger sister who's sort of like this musical and artistic savant who wanders around. We don't see her very often, but she's won an Emmy and a Grammy. And then there's me, the middle child, sort of always trying to catch up to my older sister who got a 4.0. And I had a really sort of amazing childhood. My parents were pretty good parents, and I grew up in Minneapolis public schools my entire K through 12 education. One of the challenges is being biracial. I was always trying to figure out my identity. And so, here's me and my two sisters. By the time I got to high school, here are some things that were true about Chris Brooks. So I was a football player. I was a church boy. I played inside linebacker for the Minneapolis South High Tiger football team. I had a 3.9 GPA, and I was deeply involved in gang life. And all of those things were true simultaneously, which caught up with me my senior year. So this is picture in the bottom right-hand corner is Thanksgiving dinner, my junior year. This was just right before I got in trouble my senior year. But you could, like, this Thanksgiving dinner. If I blew the picture out, you'd see the rest of my family sitting around the table, smiling. And I looked like somebody just punched me in the mouth because that season of my life was just a very sort of like dark, confusing season where I was really, really doing well in school, and I was also really, really doing well in the streets. All of that was true. All of this came to a head my senior year of high school when I had an acceptance letter to Stanford on my desk. I was playing football, inside linebacker, was National Honor Society, all the things, and got charged with first-degree attempted murder, first-degree armed robbery, first-degree burglary. I was 16 years old. I was arrested at my school on the football field and taken away down to the JDC, charged with those 3 crimes. The prosecution, in my first arraignment hearing, released to the judge the results of my MMPI report, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory Test. I was an amoral sociopath. Doesn't bode well when you're charged with 3 felonies, right? They were going to certify me as an adult and give me 18 years. Just send me away to the St. Cloud Penitentiary like forever. And it was during that time that I really had to come to grips with what my life had become and to ask myself some very serious questions like, who am I? Why am I on earth? I started asking others around me, like, who am I? Why am I on earth? And I got some really interesting answers that sort of started to shape and form who I've become. Now, I went to undergraduate. I did not do any adult time in jail. It was a miraculous series of events. There were 5 of us that committed the crime together. I definitely drove my parents' car to the crime scene. I definitely held the double-barreled sawed-off shotgun. I did all the things. There were 5 of us that went into the crime. The youngest one was a 13-year-old. His name was Joe. Joe and I both got arrested at about the same time, but the other 3 did not. So the 2 of us went to jail, or detention, juvenile detention. Joe got released, and it became known fairly quickly that Joe had turned state's evidence. They found Joe with both arms broken, both legs broken, and a bullet in his head on 26th and Cedar. I learned later that the only thing that saved my life during that season of my life was being locked up in the JDC, because there was a kill on sight on Chris Brooks too. So being locked up saved my life. But when I sort of experienced this miraculous do not go to jail experience, and I walked out with my parents on the day of my sentencing, I just decided I was out of all of it. Walked away from all the crime I was involved in, broke up with my girl, didn't go to prom, which in hindsight seems kind of stupid, like it's just prom, but I just walked away from it all. Wrote all of the colleges and universities I had been accepted at and told them I wasn't coming, and went to a tiny little school in the middle of nowhere to just kind of like rebuild my identity and rebuild my life. So, graduated college. I was married in I graduated college in 1996, was married in 1996. My wife and I just celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary last month. We have 4 children. I performed our oldest daughter's wedding in the middle of the pandemic. I have had an audience with the Pope in Rome. That is an actual, not photoshopped picture of myself and Pope Francis. I've earned multiple degrees all the way up to my doctorate degree. And the picture in the bottom right is a really interesting one. I went to speak at a public speaking event in Faisalabad, Pakistan. And after I was done speaking, some women walked up to me, and one of them handed me her child and said, "Will you please pray for my child?" And I said, why would you need me to pray for your child? She said, "Because she's a girl." Can you imagine? That's the reason why the child needed prayer, because of her gender. And that's not a knock on Pakistan. I love Pakistan. I'm just saying, this is a wild world we live in, and I've had a wild set of experiences. But after all of those things, after turning my life around, spending 25 to 30 years of my life living a life of integrity, being married for 25 years, raising a daughter that went to Carleton, all the things, I still couldn't figure out how to get my ideas funded, couldn't figure out how to find a successful trajectory in the corporate sector. If I'm just keeping it real, every time I tried to get into the corporate sector, the white boys would get the jobs, and overqualified Dr. Brooks couldn't get in. I did a lot of external consulting because that was really my only toe in the door to help organizations get things done. And if my co-founder, Dr. Paul Campbell, were in the room, he would share with you that in his corporate career, he was always number one in sales, crushing his numbers, and all the white guys kept getting all the promotions. And they kept overlooking Paul Campbell because, for whatever reason, he just didn't fit the criteria in their minds for who should climb the corporate ladder and get the big bonuses and get the promotions. So we both experienced that. That happened to both of us multiple times. There were multiple iterations of, we knew we should have gotten the promotion. We knew we should have been hired. We knew we should have gotten the opportunity. We did not. And that really sort of led to the genesis of Brown Venture Group. So we founded Brown Venture Group in June of 2018, Dr. Campbell and I, and we founded it for a wide variety of reasons, including some of the things I just told you. But there's a couple of things you need to know. I mean, I just told you my backstory. Nobody's looking for me in venture capital to show up. Nobody expects a kid from the hood who got charged with attempted murder to become a leader in the financial services, the venture industry. So that's one thing you need to know. The other thing you need to know is when Dr. Campbell and I sat down to have what turned out being our initial conversation about Brown Venture Group, even though when we had this conversation, there was no such thing as Brown Venture Group. There was not even like the core idea, really. We were looking at a singular data point, and we just sat and stared at it. And that data point was that venture capital is a gated community. And at the time, only 3% of VC was flowing to these groups aggregated: women, black folks, and Latinx folks. You take all those categories, one of them being half of the nation, smash them together, and what comes out the other side? 3% of venture capital funding. Paul and I sat and looked at each other and just sort of like bewildered terms. Like, what does this mean? Like, how could this be? We thought there must be some reason for this. So we began doing some research and digging. Long before we started doing any sort of capital raise or anything like that, we're like, we need to figure this out. So we went on a journey. We interviewed angels. We interviewed founders of color. We interviewed a lot of women who were in the venture space. I flew to Silicon. Paul flew other places. We did all of this stuff. And at the end of it, here's what we discovered. There is implicit bias in venture capital that keeps capital from flowing to those categories. And we had already decided at the table, but now this just verified, like, we've got to disrupt this. This is broken. Now, I'm going to give you a little sort of like a precursor to where we're headed here. How did venture capital get to the point where 92% of all capital in America, venture capital in America, was flowing to only white males who are 31% of the potential recipients? Best practices. Every time we asked questions and we asked probing questions about how did this come to be, we kept hearing this phrase over and over and over. Best practices. After a while, we decided we had to do some investigation of the term best practices. What does that mean? And to break down a lot of research into a very simple formula, I'll just tell you that what we found out is that there were some things in place that were keeping entrepreneurs of color and women off the playing field from jump. And the primary thing is the bottom part of our funding pyramid. You'll see $10 million of our $50 million fund is for the friends and family round. In venture, if you don't raise a friends and family round, which is like going to talk to your mom and your uncle and your auntie and all them, and they hook you up with some cash to get your idea off the ground, you can't get into certain accelerators and incubators. Until recently. Some of those things have changed, but They were keeping folks of color and women off of the playing field altogether. And so when we started our firm, we decided, like, we got to solve that. So when we proposed this this funding pyramid to the first investors, potential investors we talked to, I will tell you what we heard, and you may not believe it, now that we've raised $33 million and we're going to have 50 probably fully subscribed by the end of this calendar year. We were told by many in our community in the Twin Cities, it's never going to happen here, you should move. Leave. And I kept telling them, like, my umbilical cord's buried on the south side, I can't leave. They're like, no, it's not going to happen here, you got to leave. Go to Chicago, a lot of black folks there. Go to Atlanta, a lot of black folks there. There were a million reasons why folks did not want this idea to come to fruition. Because disruptive ideas are scary. So we marched forward with our journey. We sort of concretized our investment thesis. And in early 2020, we started our raise. And by this time, Dr. Campbell and I had added Jerome Hamilton and Chris Dykstra to our team. So there were now 4 general partners. We started our raise. We were getting little points of traction here and there, but nothing major. Because this ecosystem has become very resilient against ideas that come from communities of color. I'm just going to say it out loud. So we weren't getting the traction that we probably should have or that we thought we should have gotten. And then George Floyd was murdered. George Floyd was murdered on a corner 3 blocks from my elementary school. I've walked the corner of 38th in Chicago 1,000 times. When the memorial service for George Floyd was planned, the president of North Central University reached out to some of his people, and I was tasked with helping to build the invite list for the local participants in the memorial service. Because I'm from the South Side, and I know all the politics of the South Side, the North Side, and the St. Paul side of the river. But this singular, horrific act, in many ways, transformed a wide variety of things. One of the things that we saw immediately was large pronouncements being made by corporate entities and institutions about how they were going to release capital to help solve Brown stuff. Lots of announcements, billions and billions of dollars of announcements. This accelerated our raise. The unintended consequences, one of the unintended consequences of the murder of George Floyd is that Brown Venture Group started getting calls from Fortune 20 companies and large banks. And everybody's calling because the Twin Cities had now become and remains the center of the racial justice movement in the world, whether we want to believe it or not. When I talk to my friends overseas, they talk about George Floyd. We had a conversation with Melody Hobson. I don't know if anybody in this room knows who Melody is. Melody leads one of the largest BIPOC-led, Black-led VC firms in the nation. She's an amazing leader, very talented. She also happens to be married to one of the most famous men on planet Earth. And when we had a conversation with her in a video call with some of us partners, we asked her, what's it like to raise capital as a black woman in America? Hand-to-hand combat every day. She's married to the creator of Star Wars. So imagine Melody Hobson, who's a really visible leader, married to a very visible person, lives in Chicago, a very black city, says it's like hand-to-hand combat every day. What do you think it's like in the Twin Cities? Jiu-jitsu? I mean, it has been a journey. It has been a journey raising this capital. We have heard and seen some things that I can't even repeat. But again, the big question remains. If you look at the experience of black, indigenous people of color in America and in the Twin Cities, and you look at the best practices that exist, in the middle of the Venn, how do we determine what is a best practice? How do we even ask the right questions? We've been told that the existing system is the system that creates the good results, and if you just work the existing system, you'll get the good results. But if I had just worked the existing system, if we as Brown Venture Group had just done things as usual, we wouldn't have raised any capital. We've had to be really creative. We had to develop a brand new investment thesis with a pyramid that didn't exist before we developed it. It doesn't exist. that 5-tier pyramid, we made it up. And we made it up because the black and brown founders we talked to said, without friends and family rounds of investment, there's really not much to talk about. But the best practices told us that was not a good idea. So there's a lot of things to complain about, a lot of things that have gone wrong. I wanted to build a case to kind of get to this part of the conversation. What I don't want is for anyone who's listening to think it's impossible, we can't get anything done, it's too deeply baked, we can't extract it. I actually believe that there are some things we can do. So we've developed what we call these 3 key disciplines, Dr. Campbell and I, and we've written a paper about this. I presented it in Bologna, Italy last week at an economics conference. And this is what we believe to be true on how we can maybe start to turn away from what we don't use the language best practices in Brown Venture Group anymore. We call those things that exist existing practices. Because if they're not the best for everybody, they ain't the best. They just exist. So we're looking for emerging practices and existing practices that are equitable, but best practices, that language is tricky. It's tricky. It's kept women and people of color off the playing field for the entire history of venture capital. So number 1, shift from paternalism to partnership. We all know what paternalism is. It's baked into American society. It's American exceptionalism. We're smart, the world's dumb. We're rich, the world's poor. We have the answers, the world has all the questions. What we recommend instead is to pivot to a model that we call for versus with. We just believe that when majority society, it gets to a place where they're like, okay, we're going to stop doing projects and stop doing stuff for folks without their leadership, without their consent, without their input, and starts doing things with us, we're going to create better solutions. Every time I've looked at anything that has to do with diversity in the corporate sector, we all know diverse teams outperform homogeneous teams every single time. Why wouldn't that be true in the venture space? Let entrepreneurs of color and leaders of color lead. We created a pyramid of investment that didn't exist before, and it is probably going to change the way venture capital works in America. We're not exceptional, Dr. Campbell and I. We're not the smartest people in the room. There's hundreds, thousands, millions of us. So don't treat us like we're super exceptional. We all have great ideas. Everywhere I look in BIPOC communities, I find brilliance. But to get to that brilliance, the posture has to be, I know you're brilliant. I'm going to do stuff alongside of you, and sometimes you're going to be running point. It's just the way it's got to work. So the second one is trickier. One of the things that Dr. Campbell brings to the table is he's a deep student of behavioral science. And so we've applied behavioral science to how we think about venture capital, right? And one of the reasons why we chose to invest in technology businesses and not brick and mortar businesses, lifestyle businesses, is because we know that a technology business is the type of business that solves a problem where often there's not even an exchange between the founder and the customer. Unless it's at the very early stage and the founder is the only employee. But ultimately, a technology solution just solves problems. Sometimes there doesn't even need to be a human in the room. Technology just solves the problem. And so that neutralizes bias. And we have tried to build our investment model to neutralize bias, to just take it out of the equation. We've developed actually an AI project that we're patenting right now that is going to match investors to entrepreneurs without bias. It's almost like Tinder or something without seeing anybody. Like I like the idea, swipe right. Why not? I'll never forget, before I joined Brown Venture Group full-time on July 1st of this year, I was working my full-time job until July 1st of this year, I led DEI for a national organization. And one of the things that we decided to do was we decided to take a hard look at having people's first and last names on job descriptions. Because when people's first and last names are on job descriptions and the name is something like Mohammed or Jerome or Shantae, sometimes that resume never makes it to the top of the pile because of the name. You have to remove the bias to actually take a look at the content. So that's what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to get rid of the bias so folks can actually see the genius, the solutions, the brilliance. And I want to bear this story out, I have to tell you about a very humbling moment for me personally in the last week. So our investment thesis at Brown Venture Group has to do with Black, Latinx, and Indigenous technology entrepreneurs. We are very, very strong with the African diaspora and the African American community in the Twin Cities metro area. We have fairly good relationships with Latinx communities. We are not as strong with Indigenous Native communities. And so I have been on a personal mission to reach out to Indigenous technologists and Indigenous VC leaders to learn as much as I can so that we don't do any harm as we're out raising capital and deploying capital in these communities. So I had a conversation last week with a woman who is a rock star in the venture capital space, who's an Indigenous woman. She said, so tell me about yourself and your company. So I talked for like 10 minutes, way too long. At somewhere probably around minute 7, I was like, I probably need to shut up pretty soon because she hasn't moved or said anything, so something's going on. Well, at the end of my 10 minutes, I said, so what did you hear? She said, well, I think what you're doing is really important and you can make a difference. But if you keep using the word pipeline, Indigenous folks don't want to talk to you. How many times in investment, venture capital, businesses, do we use the word pipeline? You know what pipelines do in Indigenous America? They destroy communities. You use the word pipeline when engaging the Indigenous community, it's an F on the report card. I did not know that till last week. We now, in Brown Venture Group, are trying to retrain ourselves to use the words waterway. Water brings life, pipelines bring destruction. That's just hot off the presses, right? Like, I lead a BIPOC-focused venture capital firm, and I'm learning every single day. We all need to lean in and learn every single day how to neutralize our own implicit biases. Some of this stuff we don't even know. I didn't realize the word pipeline was problematic until last week because everything I've read, all the best practices I've seen, talk about pipelines. Not in Indian country, don't say the word pipeline. It could be a deal breaker. So I think you get the point, right? Like, there's language, there are systems, there are processes that are embedded in the current system that, because they've been seen as best practices, people just blow through them until you stop and pause and say, what did you just hear? And it would be a good practice for majority culture leaders to stop when they're talking to entrepreneurs and investors and finance sector people of color and say, what did you just hear? Dr. Campbell and I, we've heard some pretty racist things, raising capital. There are multiple times where we walked into a meeting and we're a venture capital firm. We're raising capital to provide a return on investment to the investors and transform the world in the process. There are multiple times we walked in and we've been told, so you're a nonprofit, right? Really? All people of color do is run nonprofit organizations? We live in the land of 10,000 nonprofits. It's baked into the system. We've got work to do. And what I hope as we're going through this is your mind is sort of going through your own mental Rolodex and you're asking yourself some questions about the language you use, the phrases you've learned, the phrases I've learned. I'm not immune. I was raised in the system as well. We've all got to give some serious thought to the things that we say and the best practices that we lean into. This third one is one that Dr. Campbell is really big on. I believe it as well. Cultural residency is going to contexts where people of color are leading and learning from them as they lead. I'm going to tell you a story to bring this one out. It's a tough story to tell. My mother is from rural Jamaica. And when I say rural Jamaica, I mean like no electricity, no running water Jamaica. When I was a child and I went down there to visit my grandma, I would see naked people bathing in the river. Now, in Jamaica, the West and the European nations have fallen in love with the beach. And most of the Jamaican shoreline is not owned by Jamaica because other nations have gobbled it up as their property and they use it to milk money off the island. So travel and tourism is the largest industry by far. One of the things that is sort of like a sidecar or an addendum to travel and tourism is Western missionary groups. Church groups, youth groups, all these well-meaning missionaries that want to make Jamaica Christian again. They jump on the planes, they go down to Jamaica, and most of them, in the middle of their missionary activity, do a wide variety of things, but there are some consistent things that happen. For example, if a youth group goes down with adult leaders, if there are a lot of adult leaders, the youth group usually works with the younger children, doing some sort of lesson planning or something. The older folks that are down there usually do projects, and sometimes the youth do too, like paint stuff, fix stuff, try to start micro businesses or whatever, right? So Jamaicans, we are smart, innovative, gritty people. And we figured out fairly early in this that this was kind of a game. Because when the Baptists come down and tell you about Baptist Jesus, and the Lutherans come down and tell you about Lutheran Jesus, and the Mormons come down and tell you about Mormon Jesus, and none of those Jesuses actually agree with each other, the Jamaicans figured out, like, okay, so to get what we want out of this, we're going to have to go to nod our heads, even if it doesn't make sense, right? Like, they're here, they're in the community, let's not hurt these people, we'll nod our heads. They also figured out, if we are kind to them, not only will they come in and do all of the activity they plan to do, they also come with green things in their pocket, with Washington and other presidents on the front of them. And so the community became very, very agile and smart and started getting cash from the missionaries who were on site. I'm Jamaican, I'm not dogging my people. Like, that's a smart plan, right? Here's where it gets tricky. So it became a thing that in some places, when the missionaries were done with their missionary work, got on their buses to go spend 2 or 3 days at the beach, which is part of what missionaries do when they go to Jamaica. That's why Jamaica is the most missionaried country per capita in the world, because of the beach. By the time the bus was a mile down the road, some communities were sanding the paint off of the homes that were just painted, so they could get another group to come the next week and get more cash. Nobody wins. Nobody wins in that scenario. The groups who come down thinking they're doing good and bring back pictures with little brown kids don't win. The Jamaicans who are experiencing a really weird and twisted form of like manipulation don't win. Nobody wins. The only way to make that a good thing is to allow the Jamaican people to dictate what needs to happen in their own community, and to then leverage resources from abroad to support the dreams and hopes and plans of those Jamaican people who know what the heck to do in their own community. It's called subsidiarity. It's a big word, look it up. It means the solution usually comes in very close proximity to the problem. It is hard to solve a problem in Scotts Pass, Jamaica from Minneapolis, Minnesota. We are finding it is also, in many ways, equally difficult to propose a solution to a problem in Wayzata when you've never spent time on the south side of Minneapolis, or in Cedar Riverside, or Little Earth. Everybody thinks they've got answers, but in many cases, nobody's asking the leaders who live there every single day what problems need to be solved and how would you solve them if you had the resources to do so. Cultural residency is putting yourself in the position to actually learn from the leaders on the ground what will work. This is part of our competitive advantage and our differentiator within Brown Venture Group. We have speed to solutions. The communities we serve frequently live in dense, tall building spaces. You know, you encounter different problems when you live in a 300-unit building than when you live on 2 acres in a single-family home. You innovate different ideas. Cultural residency is critical. We in Brown Venture Group, as we're forging partnerships with folks like Best Buy, this is one of the things that's on the table. We're going to be doing some education for some of their leaders because they need to hear from us, right? So I intentionally left a lot of time at the end of this I think I did. Yeah. At the end of this presentation, because what I recognize is that's a lot to swallow in a short amount of time. What I will tell you is this. I was born and raised on the South Side. I was born, for those who have been in this metro area for a long time, Lutheran Deaconess Hospital. Doesn't even exist anymore. My mother lives in Edina. My dad lives in St. Paul. My sister lives in the metro. I live in the metro. Dr. Campbell and his family live in the metro. When we were told to vacate the premises and go to Atlanta or Chicago, we stayed. I want our metro area to get it right. Almost every year, the Twin Cities is rated on certain lists as like the best place to live in the nation, or one of the best places to live in. Bike paths and lakes and Fortune 500 companies and all the things. And almost every year, the Twin Cities is ranked as one of the worst places for black people to live in America. Sometimes we're number one. There are literally 2 Twin Cities. We can do better. We must do better. And at Brown Venture Group, we just believe inherently that if we allow BIPOC entrepreneurs to put their ideas into the market, to have the necessary business scaffolding to scale those ideas, we're going to see different outcomes and a different narrative emerge in the Twin Cities, where instead of being the place where George Floyd was killed, will be the place where black and brown entrepreneurs scale their ideas. So what questions do you all have for me today? I'm here for you. Yes, sir. Wait for the mic.
Thanks. Question, you talked heavily about your journey in terms of best practices. And we know, whether it's in venture and other areas, we use the language of best practices to continue on doing what we've done in the past. In what ways can we change, not even just the terminology of best practice, but the thought process of the best ways to do things that have already been found? In what ways can we transform or even create two questions. One, how can we transform the meaning of best practices? And 2, how can we create a list of things that are, or do you have a list of things that are considered best practices, but that are actually harmful?
So let me give you an example of a best practice that we experienced as Brown Venture Group. I'm not going to name the LP that we talked to about this, but we've talked to, I think it's fair to say, over 100, maybe over 200 potential investors in this process of raising the capital. So we've got all of those experiences to cross-reference with each other. Only one made us do a background check. Now, that might be a standard practice for everybody that goes through their vetting process, but it really felt yucky for us. And we've not had it happen before or since. So for that firm, that's one of their best practices. And I know that there are other industries where getting a background check is a best practice. Is it? Why isn't everybody doing it? I could think of others. Give me a second. I'll think of another one. So here's a best practice that we are disrupting with our model. We talk to entrepreneurs of color every single week, sometimes a couple dozen. And at the end of many of those conversations, one of the things we hear back from the entrepreneur we've interviewed is, you guys talk to me like nobody else talks to me. Because the best practice is to skip through the stuff. Skip through all the personal stuff. I don't care about your backstory. I don't want to hear about your mama. I want to hear about South Minneapolis and shotguns. Tell me about your idea. What's your total addressable market? In communities of color, that is not a best practice. That is a bad practice. Cutting straight to the chase, it's inappropriate. It's like an indecent proposal or something, right? How are you just going to not care who I am as a human? But that's an existing best practice in this industry. You got 10 minutes. You better make those 10 minutes count, and if you're going to make it count, shut up and don't tell me about where you come from and what you believe. Just show me your product. I do not believe that's a best practice. I believe that's a harmful practice. And we're disrupting it. Other questions? Yes, ma'am. I saw you paying very close attention, so I know your question's going to be epic.
We'll see. Earlier today, you alluded to having some, like what your metrics and how are you going to measure success for the fund? And you didn't want to talk about it too much because you didn't want to ruin your later presentation. Is that this presentation? Can you share more about your metrics?
Yeah. So one of the things I didn't want to, I think specifically the comment that I referenced that I didn't want to share earlier that I shared in this one was around pipeline versus waterway. Our metrics for success there are some sort of traditional existing practices, right? Like to be a venture capital firm, you must provide return on investment. You must make wise decisions. We vet founders differently than a lot of the folks that we've talked to over the past 3 years. We do care about the backstory. We care deeply about the why, not just the what and the who and the how. So when we first meet a founder, we are trying to figure out, like, where does their motivation, intrinsic motivation, come from? If your motivation is to build a big business and roll on some rims and fly on jets and do the thing, or like golf down in Florida every week, like, that's not a very attractive motivator. If you watched your brother die of a rare disease and you're starting a med tech company that solves medical problems because you watched your brother die of a rare disease, hey, we got something to talk about. Because when times get tough, you're going to remember your brother. Many of our entrepreneurs, and this gets to the sort of the soft metrics, although we consider them to be pretty firm, hard metrics. Many of our entrepreneurs, their idea is born out of some really great challenges. Many innovations are born out of great challenges, but our entrepreneurs specifically, there is almost always a story that you almost have to dig at. Because many of our entrepreneurs that have been raising capital for any amount of time, they've already sort of been jaded by the existing best practice system, right? Like, they're not going to walk into a room and start talking about personal stuff. They just know better, right? Like that, well, that didn't work out the last 20 times, so I'm not going to do it again. But we are looking for things like, have you thought through who your customer is? How many of them are there? Where are they? How are you going to reach them? Is your product going to solve a problem? Because we are looking for really great ideas, but we really lean in when that great idea is not just going to make a lot of money, but it's also going to provide access to the internet for 20 million folks that don't have it right now or something, right? Like, those are interesting ideas. So our success metrics will be both, again, what I called earlier today, qualitative and quantitative, right? There's the ROI, there's the financial measurements, there's the valuation increase, all of those things. And we want to know, like, is your idea going to change the world? And if your idea is not primarily going to change the world, that doesn't mean we'll say no. Because we want people of color to win, and not every good idea is a sort of like a social justice idea or an impact investment idea. But our world needs some impact investment ideas. Our world is burning. So when we hear about ideas to do things that radically improve the environment so that humans can continue to breathe, that gets our attention. When we hear about an idea that's going to clean up the trash in neighborhoods that have been forgotten, where kids are growing up around trash, that we lean in. Because at the end of the day, Brown Venture Group exists so that we can build intergenerational wealth within communities of color, and so that those communities of color can flourish. And part of the flourishing is we've got to improve the conditions that have been created, invented, manufactured for communities of color in America. Black people didn't create the ghetto. The ghetto created the current state of black people in the ghetto. Like, we never would have thought of that. Who would think of that? I want to live in a really tough place with very few resources. We didn't do that. So I don't know if that answered your question about metrics. And part of my hesitation to go any deeper into like measurable stuff is just because sort of like the thrust of this presentation is we've got to think about other stuff. And there are good existing practices, and there are some really horrific existing practices. And the hard work is to disentangle them, almost like disaggregate them, look at each one individually, decide which ones are worth keeping, chuck the other ones. It's almost like when you become an adult and you take a look at your identity or your identities. And you're like, I was raised to be this, and this is terrible. I think I'll leave that behind. Anybody ever had that experience? That's what we need to do with today's practices in venture capital and in the financial services industry. We have to ask ourselves, if these quote-unquote best practices have been working so well, why is such a small percentage of venture capital flowing to women and people of color? The only answer we can come up with in Brown Venture Group is they are not best practices. They're best practices for a small group of folks that they work for who are the minority in this nation. And they don't work for the rest of us, so we got to disrupt them. We've got to dream new dreams and develop new practices and care about the backstory, right? We need to really pay a lot of attention to the why. The why matters. We've got to ask ourselves what the impact of any invention will be. So if it cures a lot of problems over here but causes a lot of problems over here, I don't think Brown Venture Group would invest in an idea like that. It just flies in the face of our thesis. Other questions? Right next door. Hi.
Hi. How have you had success so far with corporates and getting them to be in that cultural residency? Because in the past, I've been that bridge, and I've had a really hard time getting folks, like they'll decide they have to have the event on this day, but they don't realize, well, that's Eid. Like, what do or, have you had some success there or ideas around the training you're going to do, like with Best Buy?
So when I led DEI for College Possible, that's who I worked for, and I taught DEI to our onboarding new employees. This is the way I described DEI, and this is what I would describe as happening within corporate America right now. DEI is an ongoing journey of continuous improvement, and everybody's got an on-ramp, and not everybody has the same on-ramp, right? If you think about how your identity was formed, think back to your community of origin, your family of origin, maybe like the schools you grew up in. If you grew up in a faith community, your faith community of origin, what were those messages that were sent your direction? Well, then walk that forward 15 years, however long, and you're an adult in college. And let's say maybe you come from a small rural community somewhere, and you've never been around urban settings or folks of color, and some of those identities start to bump into each other. It's really challenging for me to be mad at somebody who's never been around people of color and doesn't know how to act around people of color. Now, there are some folks that would say, well, we live in a society where the TV's on all day long and people have cell phones and there's no excuse. I know people that have never met a person of color. I shouldn't say I know them. I know of people. I know of communities where they've basically been sort of shut off to the outside world intentionally. To answer your question as directly as I can, in corporate America, Brown Venture Group is having our greatest success, and we've got a very formal announced partnership with Best Buy, but we've got a lot of other things going on. We're in due diligence with a lot of banks and corporations and institutional investors. Inevitably, what I can't say is that someone who doesn't invest in Brown Venture Group isn't woke. That's trash. I wouldn't say that. What I will say is those who put us through due diligence and then lean in, it's because usually a leader or a group of leaders on the executive team or the board have been paying close attention to the racial injustice in America. Which means we in Brown Venture Group know, I'm not going to name any names, there are certain corporations that would not be worth our time to talk to right now. There are certain institutions that will not return our calls. But in the Twin Cities metro area, I've been very surprised. When we first started raising it, people were like, it can't happen here, leave the Twin Cities, you're going to fail. I have to be honest, there was a part of me that sort of believed that. I was like, do I have imposter syndrome? What's going on? Now that we've been talking to corporations, especially since the Best Buy announcement of the $10 million investment into Brown Venture Group, I am very pleasantly surprised by the LPs that are joining our fund and saying, please use my name. Please use my picture. Please tell anybody you want to that I'm on your cap table. It's pleasantly surprising. And even in the corporate sector, we are finding that there are corporations who are working very hard to redo or to rewrite some of their existing best practices, to figure out a way to invest in us, because most corporations don't become an LP in a first-time fund. But there are a lot of folks in the Twin Cities leaning in. It's surprising, honestly, and it's beautiful in a lot of ways. I think I may have stated this earlier. I'll state it again just in case. We are over $30 million into our $50 million raise. We've got a waterway that says we will be fully funded, fully subscribed by the end of this calendar year. We're a $50 million fund with 3 majority black owners. That says something about what's going on in the Twin Cities right now. And as angry as I can be at my birthplace and as much trash as I can talk about her or him, I really do believe that things are changing around here slowly. I really do believe that even in the 3.5 years that Brown Venture Group has been in existence, the conversations have shifted. And we are finding doors that before were slammed shut, locked, glued. Now they're cracked open. And some of the early folks we engaged that were like, now they want to talk. It's an ongoing journey of continuous improvement, and it takes time. It's not a microwave, it's a crock pot. We all know what crock pots here are in the Twin Cities, right? For a risk-averse metro area, which we are, for a fairly fiscally conservative, outside of philanthropy, metro area, which we are, this is just going to take some time. And we're chipping away to the best of our ability with our partners. We're not exceptional. Like, Jeff and other entrepreneurs and other folks are chipping away at this thing, black tech talent. There's a lot of folks, the Center for Economic Inclusion, there's a lot of folks chipping away. The narrative is changing. It's slow, but it's happening. And I can't wait to see the Twin Cities that emerges out of the ashes of the racial reckoning here. I think this place is going to be overwhelmingly better for women and people of color than it ever has been. I've got probably time for one more. I have time for no more. No more. All right, Jeff, come take your podium back. Thank you for having me.